"Enjoy the company jacket and the gift card," she announced. Her voice had that nasal, condescending pitch, sounding exactly like someone whose expensive fillers had settled wrong, choking off any capacity for basic human empathy. That was the moment I realized it was actually happening. Olivia Lawson, our chief culture officer and the direct result of the chief executive officer deciding his daughter needed a playground, was firing me in front of the entire company. There was absolutely no warning, no write-up from human resources, no quiet tap on the shoulder asking for a private chat. Just a cheerful public execution during our quarterly all-hands meeting, sandwiched awkwardly between announcements about the new kombucha flavors in the break room and our Q3 burn rate. I stood there, 54 years old, hands folded, watching her pretend to read from a digital tablet containing notes she definitely had not written. "Harold has been a foundational member of the Ethelon family," she purred, sounding entirely like she wasn't about to toss me into traffic with a smile. "But due to shifting cultural priorities and a misalignment in our synergistic momentum, we have decided it is time to part ways." She reached into one of those absurd welcome crates we normally hand out to unpaid interns and pulled out a cheap polyester company jacket. My name was scribbled on the tag in permanent marker, making me feel like an unclaimed item at a lost and found. Tucked inside the pocket was a $75 gift card to a vegan wrap place that didn't even have a location in my zip code. "Oh, and unfortunately," she added, tilting her head like she had just remembered a minor detail, "your Q4 bonus did not meet the newly updated performance rubric, so that will be withheld." The newly updated performance rubric. I literally wrote the original performance rubric. I could feel 68 heads swiveling in my direction in agonizing slow motion. The sales team started tugging at their collars. The row of junior developers suddenly found their phones fascinating. The only person in the room who didn't flinch was our chief financial officer, whose face clearly communicated that he had just bought a vacation home and refused to be dragged into this mess. So, I smiled. It was that calm, utterly relaxed smile that terrifies human resources professionals deep down to their corporate souls. I took the jacket, holding it by 2 fingers like it was soaked in toxic waste. I felt its scratchy, awful texture. "Thanks for the memories," I said. My voice was completely steady, friendly even. Not because I wasn't boiling inside, but because losing your temper is for amateurs. I am a professional. If you are enjoying this story, go ahead and hit subscribe. 82% of you listening right now have not done it yet, and hitting that button helps us keep exposing these corporate nightmares. Anyway, back to Olivia's little theater of public humiliation. I turned around and walked out of the conference room without slamming a single door. That detail is important. They wanted a meltdown. They wanted a crazy guy narrative they could pass around the company chat like a joke. I gave them absolutely nothing. Just the quiet sound of my shoes on the hardwood floor and the faint scent of the organic lavender air freshener trying to mask the rot of the company culture. Here is what nobody else noticed in that room. Human resources never had me sign a single document. No exit packet, no non-disclosure agreement reminder. No standard form acknowledging my termination was lawful and fair. Just a perky, automated email hitting my phone, stating my access would be deactivated by 4:30 in the afternoon and wishing me luck in my future endeavors. They skipped the paperwork because someone in that room knew this termination was not clean. Olivia had been gunning for me since the day she waltzed into the role. Her job basically consisted of being a professional brunch enthusiast with access to the corporate payroll. She hated that I had real influence. She hated my history with the company. Most of all, she despised the fact that the engineering and operations teams actually trusted me. The tension really started when I flagged some ridiculous inconsistencies in the Q2 budget. Things like $25,500 labeled as cultural realignment seminars that mysteriously matched the exact dates and location of her lavish destination birthday trip. When I brought it up, human resources told me to focus on positive forward momentum. Now, here we were. I walked straight past the glass-walled offices where the executives were pretending to stare intently at their monitors. I passed the break room where someone was literally slicing a cake to celebrate the end of a successful quarter. I walked past the front reception desk, where the office manager gave me a look of pure pity. Outside, the sky was bright blue and completely indifferent to my sudden unemployment. I sat in my car and stared at that stupid jacket for a long minute. Then I popped my trunk, threw it inside, and pulled out my personal laptop. Not the work machine, the personal one I never connected to the corporate network, the one with a highly specific encrypted partition. I opened a file named Clause 18.9c. Olivia might have just fired me, but I was the guy holding the keys to the entire technical framework. She had absolutely no idea what she had just set in motion. 5 weeks before the polyester jacket incident, I was sitting in a dimly lit booth at a local pub that always smelled faintly of stale beer and quiet secrets. My laptop was open on the sticky wooden table, and a glass of bourbon rested dangerously close to the keyboard. Sitting across from me was my personal attorney. Her name was Rebecca. She was 38 years old, possessed a deeply cynical view of corporate America, and wore tailored suits that looked like modern armor. She leaned over to look at my screen, letting out a low whistle through her teeth. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this, Harold?" she asked, raising one eyebrow. I took a slow sip of my bourbon and nodded. They have been treating me like a disposable employee, but for the last 3 years, I have been functioning like an owner. It is time I secured some actual insurance. The insurance we were discussing was a highly specific licensing clause buried so deep within our massive vendor consolidation contract that it practically wore active camouflage. You see, while everyone at Ethelon was completely obsessed with flashy user interface updates and whatever new synergy initiative Olivia was dreaming up, I had spent 9 agonizing months rebuilding our back-end framework. The company's digital infrastructure had been a nightmare of patched-together third-party tools held together by the software equivalent of duct tape and prayers. So I built a brand new system. It was clean, highly secure, incredibly scalable, and flawless. But here is the kicker. I built it entirely through my own limited liability company. My company had technically been listed on the Ethelon vendor ledger for years, hiding in plain sight under operations architecture and platform integration. Nobody in accounting noticed when the invoice structure changed slightly. Nobody blinked an eye when I submitted a comprehensive statement of work that quietly routed the licensing rights of the new framework directly to my own company rather than Ethelon. And absolutely nobody, least of all Olivia, bothered to read the dense legal jargon regarding the immediate revocation of usage rights in the event of the improper dismissal of key personnel. It sailed through the legal department like a ghost. It was rubber-stamped, filed away, and completely forgotten. The clause was terrifyingly elegant in its simplicity. If Ethelon ever terminated me without a formal performance review and heavily documented legal cause, the perpetual software license would instantly self-revoke. There would be no lengthy lawsuits. There would be no messy arbitration process. Just an immediate catastrophic lights out for their entire operational capability. Was it a ruthless move? Perhaps. Was it entirely within the bounds of the law? Oh, absolutely. Would anyone notice it unless they were analyzing the contract with a legal microscope? Not a chance. Olivia never suspected a single thing. She was far too busy optimizing the corporate culture by hiring a $5,900 Aura specialist for the executive retreat. On the very day I finalized the licensing contract, she was actively hosting a live social media stream about her morning wellness manifestation routine. Meanwhile, I was quietly purchasing the digital insurance policy that possessed the power to completely implode her fake little kingdom. Before making it official, I ran extensive tests. I tested the clause in a sandbox environment and had external legal counsel run simulations. Not a single red flag popped up. Every signature was completely clean. Even the incredibly overworked compliance team just logged it into the licensing repository like it was any other standard vendor line item. That is the fundamental problem with being quiet in a loud corporate environment. People naturally assume you are harmless. They completely forget that the quiet employees are the ones quietly building the walls everyone else is standing on. After all the testing was complete, I printed exactly one physical copy. I locked it inside a fireproof safe in my home office. The digital version was encrypted with military-grade security and backed up to 2 separate offline drives. I honestly never wanted to use it. Let me be perfectly clear about that. I actually enjoyed my job. I despised the relentless corporate politics, the rampant nepotism, and the way Olivia treated our vendor budgets like her personal checking account. But I loved the complex systems. I loved the engineering team. I loved the actual work. But every single time Olivia flashed her unnervingly perfect teeth and referred to me as a legacy asset in meetings, I felt my patience thinning. When I caught her quietly deleting internal messages regarding massive budget reallocations, I knew the countdown timer had officially started. Clauses like 18.9c are essentially silent time bombs. Nobody ever hears the ticking until the explosion happens. The best part was that the clause was not even buried under complex legal jargon. It was written in plain English, sitting proudly under a bold header that read "Reversion of Use License upon improper termination." So, when Human Resources handed me that insulting $75 gift card and told me they were moving in a different direction, I did not shout, I did not demand answers. I just smiled my calm smile, walked out to my car, and thought to myself, activate the clause. Olivia had floated into Ethelon a year prior, carrying a designer tote bag and the unwavering confidence of a woman who had never faced a negative consequence in her entire life. She possessed zero relevant experience, yet her father handed her a title with absolute authority and zero accountability. She immediately took over the second floor with expensive scented candles and started taking aim at anyone who actually knew how the company functioned. Her primary weapon was passive aggression, which she wielded relentlessly. If I pointed out a flaw in her absurd plans, she would accuse me of having a scarcity mindset. I was desperately trying to keep the company solvent, while she was actively bleeding it dry. It was exactly 11:15 at night on a Wednesday when I finally found the smoking gun. I had been meticulously combing through the Q3 bonus allocation ledgers because something smelled incredibly foul, like rotting garbage hidden behind an expensive cabinet. The company was operating well under budget, yet the allocated performance bonuses were coming up desperately short. I clicked into the raw financial logs, cross-referenced the data against our payroll software, and then cross-referenced it again against the project closeout reports. Then I saw it. A massive direct transfer labeled as an employee enrichment initiative. The total amount was $26,500. I blinked, rubbing my tired eyes, assuming this must be some sort of placeholder error. I pulled the specific vendor invoice identification number and searched the main system. There was absolutely nothing. No registered vendor profile, no approval chain, nothing but a fake vendor code and a digital timestamp created exactly 4 days before the Q3 bonus notifications were suspiciously delayed. I traced the approval flow through the back-end audit logs, navigating the system I had built to track every single digital footprint. Olivia had manually overridden the bonus allocations, diverted the money to this ghost event, and transferred the funds directly to her own external account. She had quite literally enriched herself using the money meant for the engineering team. I printed the report immediately. I did not email it, and I did not save it to the company cloud server. I held the physical paper in my hands, staring at it under the harsh kitchen light. I did not alert the legal team or blast an angry email to the board. Instead, I quietly slipped the document into a thick folder I kept on my bookshelf. I let it marinate because I knew the executioner's sword was already swinging my way. This simply confirmed that the blade was sharp. The very next morning, I was called into a sudden, unscheduled meeting with Human Resources. Jessica's office smelled heavily of artificial lavender and immense corporate cowardice. Olivia was already sitting there, casually sipping an expensive iced coffee as if she had already won. Jessica looked completely exhausted, like she had aged 4 years overnight. She cleared her throat nervously and began reading directly from a printed statement. Harold, we have noticed a pattern of interpersonal friction and sustained negativity that is beginning to severely impact the culture here at Ethelon. As such, executive leadership has decided to move in a different direction. Olivia nodded solemnly, pretending to look sympathetic. I know this is incredibly difficult, she added, offering a perfectly rehearsed sigh. But sometimes a fresh start is a true blessing in disguise. I stared at her in total silence for 5 excruciating seconds, just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably in her chair. Then I stood up. "Do I need to sign anything today?" I asked Jessica directly. Jessica panicked slightly. "Oh no, we will follow up with a digital exit packet. There are no immediate signatures required today." That was it. That was the moment I knew they had entirely skipped the formal legal process. No documentation of cause, no performance improvement plan, just a vague accusation of negativity. I walked out of the building with absolute calm. Back in my car, I connected my personal laptop to my mobile hotspot. I dragged 2 specific files into an encrypted folder. The first was the bonus theft report, which I immediately forwarded to Rebecca. The second was the digital trigger for Clause 18.9c. I uploaded it to a private repository owned by my limited liability company. It was a version-controlled time bomb, authenticated and securely notarized. Ghosting a toxic company is a highly surgical procedure. You simply wipe your fingerprints off the glass and let their own incompetence bring the structural rot into focus. I did not update my professional networking profiles. I did not post a dramatic goodbye message. I simply vanished. Behind the scenes, Apex Ventures officially began their intensive due diligence process for the massive Series C pitch. There was a $68 million deal sitting on the table. Suddenly, every single spreadsheet, process map, and vendor agreement I had ever touched was placed under a massive magnifying glass. Except now, I was not there to explain any of it. I watched the chaos unfold from afar. First, the finance department accidentally sent over a corrected revenue projection that was off by $1.9 million. They attempted to blame a software delay, but the truth was they simply did not know how to run the 2-step audit process I had custom built for them. Then came the catastrophic technical unraveling. 5 critical microservices collapsed completely, within a span of 48 hours. The external contractor Olivia had hired could not troubleshoot the system because the back-end framework was entirely built using my proprietary architecture. Meanwhile, our vendor lead times exploded to 96 hours. Customer complaints started rolling in like a tidal wave. Olivia tried to spin the disaster during a video meeting, calling it a strategic growth recalibration phase. She actually claimed the team was reclaiming their operational sovereignty. It was purely corporate jargon attempting to mask the fact that the company was actively burning to the ground. Every single missed deadline was a massive crack in the foundation. Every question from the Apex Ventures analysts regarding system reliability felt like a sledgehammer against the glass. They were bleeding data, bleeding trust, and rapidly bleeding time. My limited liability company's website received 9 new visits from corporate IP addresses in just 3 days. Yet I remained completely silent. Sometimes, the most devastating thing you can do is let the wrong people talk long enough to completely bury themselves. And Olivia was happily handing out the shovels. Exactly 9 days before the massive Series C pitch to Apex Ventures, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown corporate number. Normally, I would let an unrecognized number drop straight to voicemail. But something about the caller identification displaying the local financial district made me incredibly curious. I answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, is this Harold Brooks?" The voice on the other end was entirely stiff and deeply uncomfortable. "This is Thomas Hughes, outside legal counsel for Ethelon. I was calling to informally ask if you might be open to consulting on a few highly time-sensitive vendor integration matters. Nothing official, of course. Just some extremely light guidance." His voice carried that distinct, nervous edge of a lawyer who knew he was standing on a landmine but was desperately trying to pretend it was just a rock. I let the silence drag on the line just long enough to make him start breathing heavily. "I appreciate the phone call, Thomas," I replied calmly, "but I am absolutely not available for informal anything." He stumbled over his words. "Right, I completely understand. I just thought I would attempt to reach out. We are currently in final pitch preparations, and certain crucial items you previously managed seem to have significant operational gaps." That was an incredibly polite way of saying the entire company was currently on fire. I knew exactly the gaps he referenced. The automated vendor flow systems were entirely undocumented on their end. The specific workarounds I installed to prevent massive fulfillment delays were effectively gone. Knowledge management does not happen by magic, but they let me go without a single transition meeting because Olivia genuinely believed corporate aesthetics were far more scalable than technical competence. Thomas thanked me awkwardly and hung up the phone in defeat. That evening, I poured myself a very generous glass of expensive scotch and pulled a heavy manila envelope from my filing cabinet. Inside was a single sheet of weighted paper, printed on my limited liability company's official letterhead. It was properly dated, thoroughly notarized, and entirely devastating. The document was titled Formal Notification of Clause Activation. It stated, in extremely clear legal language, that due to my termination without formal cause or proper documentation, the exclusive licensing rights to the Ethalon backend framework were immediately revoked in accordance with Clause 18.9c. Access was completely unauthorized as of the exact timestamp of the letter's receipt. I placed the document inside a certified envelope addressed to every single board member, including the chief executive officer. There was no casual email attached. This was a physical, tangible, and undeniable legal strike. I booked a private courier to hand-deliver it to the Ethalon corporate office first thing the next morning. I knew exactly how the chaos would unfold. First, there would be immense confusion. Then, absolute panic. Finally, there would be a frantic boardroom meeting where someone would desperately ask what the clause actually meant. Thomas would know. He had approved the original contract during the vendor audit phase. By the time that physical letter hit the massive boardroom table, he would realize that I had legally repossessed the engine of their entire company right before their most critical race. The morning of the massive Series C pitch, I actually attended the meeting. The boardroom was located 34 stories up, featuring a panoramic view of the city and an absurdly expensive glass table. Jonathan Pierce, the lead investor from Apex Ventures, had specifically requested my presence to ensure technical continuity in the room. The Ethalon board was far too desperate and flustered to deny his request. Olivia had absolutely no idea I was coming until I walked into the lobby. She looked completely horrified, as if she had just seen a ghost. But she desperately tried to maintain her composure. She stood at the front of the room, wearing an impossibly expensive designer blazer, clicking through a presentation filled with hollow buzzwords. She talked about cultural throughput and synergistic emotional alignment, completely avoiding any mention of the actual product stability. Then, she clicked to a slide outlining their aggressive roadmap for Q3 of 2026. We are perfectly positioned to triple our recurring revenue over the next 24 months through proprietary system leverage, she announced, smiling widely at the investors. That was the exact moment Jonathan slowly opened his thick leather diligence folder. He did not speak immediately. He just flipped through the pages, letting the silence stretch across the room. Olivia's rehearsed smile began to slightly tremble. Her phone, sitting face down on the table, began lighting up constantly. She had 15 missed calls and 4 voicemails, all from her frantic legal team. Before we proceed any further, Jonathan said, his voice as calm and precise as a surgeon's scalpel, can we clarify a rather significant detail? He pulled a single printed document from his folder and placed it on the glass table. This is a termination memo for Harold Brooks, he stated, looking directly at the chief executive officer. It clearly states he was fired for negativity and cultural misalignment. Was this termination formally reviewed by internal legal counsel? The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. The chief executive officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly looking incredibly pale. Jonathan then pulled out the second document. This is a formal letter from a limited liability company, invoking Clause 18.9c. He looked around the terrified room. It appears your back-end software license has been fully revoked due to improper termination. You do not own your own technology. The silence that followed Jonathan's statement was absolute and suffocating. Olivia made a strange, gasping sound, staring at her constantly vibrating phone as if praying it would suddenly offer an explanation that could save the day. You no longer own your own back-end systems, Jonathan continued, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. The critical fulfillment integrations, the complex customer data pipelines, the foundational application programming interfaces, and the complete vendor stack you are currently pitching to us no longer belong to this company. The chief executive officer, previously radiating wealthy arrogance, now looked entirely broken. He turned to the general counsel, who was standing completely still, his face pale. "How did this happen?" the chief executive officer whispered frantically. "I drafted the clause myself," I stated from the back row. My voice was incredibly calm, cutting through the rising panic in the room like a cold blade. "Your legal department fully approved it during the comprehensive crosswalk audit phase last year. The ownership of the intellectual property remained firmly with my limited liability company, contingent entirely upon my continued employment without proper legal cause for termination." Jonathan slid the printed contract across the glass table. "Every single investor sitting at this table is currently being shown a product that cannot legally operate," he said bluntly. "You are presenting absolute vaporware." The chief technology officer buried his face in his hands, completely devastated. The vice president of sales stood up and walked directly over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking as though he might be contemplating an immediate career change via the fastest route downward. Olivia desperately tried to salvage the catastrophic situation. "Wait, this is just a technicality," she insisted, waving her hands wildly. "We terminated him because he was constantly undermining morale. This was a critical cultural decision, not a technical failure." Jonathan did not even bother to look in her direction. "This is not a cultural decision," he replied coldly. "This is a fundamental failure of ownership and basic corporate governance." He slowly stood up from the expensive leather chair, buttoning his suit jacket. "Congratulations," he said, his voice echoing in the silent boardroom. "You just lost your entire company." He turned and walked straight toward the heavy glass doors. Before exiting, he paused, looked over his shoulder directly at Olivia, and delivered the final blow. "I hope that cheap company jacket was worth $48 million. Then he walked out, taking the massive investment deal and the entire future of the company with him. The immediate aftermath was pure chaos. The board members completely erupted in anger, shouting over one another, demanding explanations from the general counsel and the chief executive officer. Olivia tried to speak, but nobody was listening to her anymore. The reality of the situation had finally crashed down on them. The quiet engineer they had publicly humiliated had carefully constructed a massive legal cage around their entire operation and simply walked away with the only key. I did not stick around to watch the rest of the arguments. I stood up from my chair in the back row, holding that ridiculous polyester company jacket neatly folded under my arm. I walked slowly out of the boardroom, my footsteps steady and deliberate on the glossy tile floor. Right as I passed a small catering table near the elevator bank, I stopped. I looked down at the jacket, noting the cheap screen-printed logo that represented everything wrong with modern corporate nepotism, and I dropped it directly into the trash can. I did not even look back as the elevator doors closed. When I finally walked out of the building, the afternoon air was crisp and incredibly peaceful. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a new email from the Apex Ventures legal team. The subject line was incredibly brief, but told me everything I needed to know. It read, "Let us discuss the immediate acquisition of your limited liability company. Name your terms." I let out a long, slow breath, feeling an immense sense of absolute closure. Because when an incompetent executive attempts to erase your entire legacy with a $75 gift card and a fake smile, there is truly only one appropriate response. You build an unbreakable system they cannot possibly replace, and you let the deafening silence of their own failure do the rest.